Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to Kansas City. Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to leave that.
Kansas City Underground.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to KCBC. This is your host, Michael Reisinger. I have a very special guest. I know I say that with every episode, but this dude is one of my best friends and just a mentor and a teacher and just a sage in my life. His name is Rob Wegner. He is a part of the Kansas City Underground and so much more. Rob, welcome to the show, man.
I am so happy to be here in Kingdom Studios with Michael on the podcast.
Yeah, buddy. So it's funny. Like I told everybody for the first time after marinating on it for a month at the fire at your house, because we meet at your house, a bunch of other dudes on Thursday nights. And I said, I think I'm ready to start a podcast now too. And you like perked up and you've just been one of the biggest supporters of this.
Proud of you, man.
And so, man, it's just like totally like full circle having you here. It's a convergence of everything. You were there for me, like right when I got laid off, right at the beginning of my Shift KC journey, which again, I've told people that was through Kansas City Underground and Jeremiah. We had Jeremiah on the show. You've been there for the creating of Vocati Ad Servidium, and I've helped you on special projects. I've helped you move people and ride around in the van and do odd jobs. Dude, we have been. It's weird. It's crazy. I don't have video yet, but it's like it's occurring to me right now.
The mud and the blood, man.
There's like, oh, I like that. I like that mud and the blood.
Yeah, man.
What does that mean to you, man?
Oh, it means that we live life together in the valleys, and when we don't know where to go or what to do or what to say, the grief is so big and the challenges seem so large, but man, we also know how to build joy together. Like I think about last Thursday night, it's like 2 hours of childish laughter.
Oh my gosh. There was like movie quotes and conspiracy theories and
Mel's hole.
Sure. I'll put a link to that
in the show notes.
Yeah, that show Outer Range with Josh Brolin being based off of like a real life story. Well, I guess that's debatable, right?
It means we're truly in it together. It's
absolutely.
Life together, man.
And so
this podcast fills my heart with so much joy, man. And the way that you've done it with how you came out of the chute, got locked and ready to rock, man. Yeah. It's been amazing. Most podcasts don't mature to the levels yours has in such a short amount of time, which says a lot about who you are and the energy and the focus and the intensity you bring to what you do. So well done, man.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate you, man. You are absolutely one of those people that I look to for focus and energy and support. And man, I was talking to Timmy last night at the Mavericks game, and he was just like, man, I love meeting with Rob, and Rob's always got something that he's walked through that he's able to share. And you're just one of a small handful of mighty people that are leaders in the Kansas City Underground. And so I just wanted to give you, usually I'll give people like long introductions and explain what they do, but I want you to tell everybody, what you do, what Kansas City Underground is, and NewThing, and anything else you want to kind of set the stage with. Because you're an author as well. We're talking about your book as well here.
Oh, thank you. I'm one of the directors of the Kansas City Underground. We are a decentralized network of simple expressions of church that are hyper-local. They're deeply rooted in a particular pocket of people, in a particular corner of culture or a neighborhood or an affinity group in our city. It's people who want to see our city the way that Jesus would see our city. They want it to be filled with beauty and with justice and the kind of good news that is inextinguishable, brings that kind of hope to your soul and meaning to your life and your relationships. So we are spread out throughout the city. We started in the kind of southwestern corner with a handful of, I guess you could call them missional leaders or dreamers. And now we've got more than 100 communities around Kansas City, supported by 11 different what we call hub teams. Those are teams that support, equip, coach and strengthen people that are living with a sense of what we call their masterpiece mission. In other words, everybody who's breathing, the two most important days of your life is the first one's when you're born. And the second one is the day you discover why. That's something what Mark Twain wrote. And your masterpiece mission is when you realize, it's in a letter in the New Testament that Paul wrote. And after Jesus, he's definitely the most influential person when it comes to the life of the church, as it transcends time and history, not just in North America. And he says that we are God's masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus for good works. In other words, you're not just a speck on the timeline of history. You're not an accident. You've been born on purpose, with a purpose, for a purpose. And when God looks at you, he sees you as a masterpiece. He also sees your incredible brokenness and flaws and foibles, but he doesn't just see you as you are. He sees you as what you were made to become. So we want to help people discover their masterpiece mission. And sometimes that's a marketplace endeavor, and sometimes it's going deep in a particular neighborhood and wanting to see the culture of that neighborhood come alive. Sometimes for people, there's a certain cause that making sure, for example, that children that are in the foster care system are properly cared for. I mean, it just goes on and on and on.
That's right.
So the Kansas City Underground exists to help, and we use the word ordinary people. And what we mean by that is you don't have to have a bunch of degrees. You don't have to have been to seminary. You don't have to be a religion expert. God is writing a unique story through every single person's life, and you're actually the expert on your story. And when you begin to discover your gifts and your passion and see these themes that start to emerge from your story, people get a sense of awakening. I've seen that in you.
Amen.
Yeah. I mean, as you've gone through Shift KC, as you've launched this podcast, it's like this mission line is on in your heart, and it's internal motivation. There's no one breathing down your neck.
That's right.
It's something that we would say the Spirit of God has put inside of you. Everybody has that, but not everybody has discovered that. Like, that's something God intends for us to experience. And so we're committed then to these kind of simple expressions of the church that emerge out of that kind of lived mission in a particular place with a particular people. And we love it, man. And we see the church not as like a building or a program led by professionals. It's actually, the primary metaphor in the New Testament is that of a family. And think of it like how a family is a decentralized network. You can have families with multiple generations. And the goal is you want everyone to see, someday we hope our kids will have families. We don't want them to live in our basement their whole life, Right. And so we want to see everyone live into that unique expression, of family that Jesus empowers and unpacks, and that kind of extended spiritual family around Jesus' leadership. We want that to get into every single network of relationships in our city. We think that would actually elevate our city. A grassroots movement, like we're into this patient fermentation of a grassroots movement of ordinary people living on mission in the everyday stuff of life.
Right.
And trying to make Jesus' kingdom, which again can be a scary word to a lot of people, but it's a kingdom that comes through service. It comes through love and sacrifice. And Jesus said that we should pray his kingdom would come, his will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. So it's like the life of heaven invading earth.
Absolutely.
We want that everywhere. So that's what the Kansas City Underground's about. I'm one of the directors. I'm on one of those hub teams down here in the western edge of the city. Yeah. And then I also work for an organization called NewThing, and which I have mixed feelings about because, NewThing sounds like something from the 90s. It's a new thing.
I picture the intro credits of like the old Terminator movies and stuff, the Corolco logo.
Right. But NewThing's really interesting. Comes out of this Old Testament passage where this guy says, "Behold it, do you see the new thing?" And he's saying, like, God is always doing a new thing. There's something always springing up. And so NewThing is designed to come alongside leaders in the church who aren't just thinking about their castle, but they're thinking about God's kingdom in a city or a region. We like to think of them as movement makers. They're catalytic people. They want to bring together like-minded people in a city or a region to say, hey, how can we work together? Not just inside of like my denomination or my church brand. Like, how do we, as the church of, let's say, Kansas City, work together to see disciples of Jesus be transformed and become like Jesus, and then begin to multiply their life into others, and then new expressions of the church, and not just new churches, but a new kind of church, a church that really exists for the flourishing of the city. So NewThing forms networks that start new expressions of the church, and it started 15 years ago in Chicago, and now we're working in more than 40 nations around the world. And we form, for example, here in Kansas City right now, there's 3 networks. There's North, and then there's East, and there's one in City Center, and then there's actually 4th, the South Network's about to be relaunched. And together in the history of Kansas City, we've started about 60 what you would call sort of legacy churches or predominant model churches, and probably a couple hundred microchurches. And so these networks, we work together to start new expressions of the church to bless the city. And what's nuts is NewThing now is there's more than 1,200 networks in 40 nations. There's about 25,000 churches involved in those networks. And last year we started more than 8,500 new churches around the world. And it's a weird organization because it's really just a network of networks around the world. And everybody's working locally with their network while staying connected to these kind of crazy movement makers around the world. So those are my 2 primary jobs. I also do, coaching and training on the side. I've written a few books,
Yes, sir.
But I'm very much like a practitioner. I write books to help the people and the movements I'm a part of.
Absolutely. And so much in what you just said, you really set the stage for this interview. I love too how you said there have been legacy churches that have been planted out of the movement and micro churches. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. And I want to just remind people as you're listening that because we don't have video and we don't have the fancy graphics and stuff yet, but if you go to KC Underground's website, they have done a wonderful job of making all of this visual. So you can see the hubs in the city. You can see where the microchurches are. You can also see some helpful visuals. And one of the things that I love too is about the paradigm, and it's the pyramid. And I believe that was inspired by Tampa Underground.
That's correct.
That's right. Because I asked you about it. I was like, this is something I would love to do as I'm talking to businesses about fixing their leadership structure. And so to describe it to everybody, you correct me if I'm wrong, okay? But I've nerded out on it so much. I love it so much. But it's the pyramid, and it shows the traditional or prevailing sort of model of church. And you have the leaders on the top, and there's everybody on the bottom of this pyramid. And the folks, at the bottom are looking to the leaders for guidance and things, and strategy and structure and all that. Or in the Starfish in the Spirit, they're looking at a spider, and we'll explain that because the spider has a head, right? And then what you do is you turn the pyramid upside down. So all the leaders are at the bottom of this pyramid, and it's a equip and send sort of structure, right? It's
exactly
we're going to help you. If I'm saying we leaders, Director Rob, right? Brian, Timmy, Bree, these folks in the underground that equip people, we equip you with what you need for your masterpiece mission, your context, right? Mm-hmm. I don't want to introduce too many terms that folks won't understand,
right?
If they're beginners to this concept, but there's the structure of leadership is we are servant leaders, and we're serving you as the person who is planting a church in your neighborhood, mm-hmm. planting a legacy church in a part of the city that doesn't currently have a structure where people can go and worship together, right? But there's a lot of things I think that you're doing. It's very unconventional, but at the same time, it's going back to like Acts, mm-hmm. the book of Acts. Mm-hmm. So
the original design for the church.
It seems foreign to a lot of folks like myself who grew up in a church environment, and there was a building we went to. And I remember the resistance and things I had to go through, in learning that. And I just appreciate the approach. Why? I guess I know I went in a lot of different directions with that. Why is the KC Underground important more now, more than ever?
Well, I think, first of all, I want to say that we think it takes all forms of the church to serve a city. So when we say legacy church, I'm not saying that with a tone of dismissal or looking down upon it. Like you, I grew up in a legacy model church.
Right.
And when we say legacy model, most people would, I think, connect with what's typically a congregation that owns a building. There's programs the church offers. There's a weekly worship service. It's typically led by a professional, vocational pastor. And that form of the church is necessary and important. But I think what inadvertently happens is when we have a pyramid structure with a few at the top who have a sense of responsibility for, we need to know what the vision is, then we need to design the programs. And it becomes a culture of we can do it. So it's like the religious professionals, we can do it and you can help. And oftentimes it can create a codependent, consumeristic relationship where the church inadvertently becomes so like a distributor of religious goods and services. And that form of the church has been, if you just look at all the statistics, the drop-off is breathtaking.
And when you say drop-off, you mean?
Like the number of people who are attending that or find it meaningful, or
Sure.
even people that are spiritually curious, like a smaller and smaller and smaller percentage of them are going to go to that form of the church to try to explore their questions.
And something I want to say too, because I've asked you about this too, is where do you get that data from?
Well, there's a number of organizations. I mean,
Yep.
Anywhere from like Pew Research to Barna to Lifeway Research. The data's out there,
Right.
But our primary motivation in the Underground isn't really a pragmatic, we want to get more people to go to church. We don't even like to use the phrase "go to church."
You talk about the difference between counting and measuring.
Yeah. For us, it's more about, okay, what was Jesus' original dream for the church? What did he have in mind? And what did it look like in its earliest days? And then when you look at the church where it's like this thriving grassroots movement in places like it is in India today, or in China, or parts of Africa, the question is, how do we return to that? And for us, ultimately, the church is designed to be this family on mission. And there's these, these heavyweight phrases that if you've ever been around the church world, you've probably heard things like the priesthood of all believers. It's like, what in the world does that mean? Well,
Sounds like a movie.
It does. But it's this, it's a theological statement that says, since Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and the coming of the Holy Spirit, which is God's presence that is available when someone puts their hope and trust in Jesus as their leaders, their teachers, their Lord, they are filled by the Holy Spirit. In other words, there isn't like a senior varsity Holy Spirit and a junior varsity Holy Spirit. It's not like everybody, there's something in the human spirit that wants to look for like a priest or a shaman to be the mediator between us and God. And what Jesus is saying is, I'm the only mediator. Now you have full access. And you know what? You receive the same Holy Spirit that your pastor received. And you have as much of a calling as any pastor or religious professional. And we want to create a culture where everybody can reach their maximum influence. And when you begin to look at the book of Ephesians, which is this letter Paul wrote to the early church on how's the church supposed to work? What's the design for it? Again, you go back to Ephesians chapter 1 is this vision of everything being filled with all the good things of God. And then it's like, well, how's that going to happen? And Paul says, you're God's masterpiece, created for good works. In other words, imagine heaven swallowing earth and everything flourishing and everything being as God designed it. And you have a part of that. Like there's a part of that mission that belongs to you.
Well, it can't happen unless
it's a grassroots movement.
We
unlock everything.
Yeah.
In every person, you know? And then you jump forward a little bit later on that letter, and he talks about the role of equipping, like equipping and training. And so the underground, we exist to say, hey, you can do it, we can help. It's not that we can do it and we're going to have a program and show you where you can volunteer. It's like, hey, what is your calling? What has God made you to do? And how can we help provide training and equipping so you can reach your maximum influence? And then as that begins to happen in networks of relationships and neighborhoods and different corners of culture and every sphere of society around the city, then you begin to see that fullness growing. So that's the heart behind it, man. That's why we're doing what we're doing. And we're unashamedly like followers of Jesus. We think he's the smartest man who ever lived. We think he conquered death itself, that he is still inviting us to be his students, to be his apprentices, to be his disciples, that he can show us how to live the fully alive life. Jesus is the master at the art of living, and he's still taking apprentices. And it's not about being good enough. It's not about performing religiously to get God to accept me.
Yeah.
That's what he accomplished on the cross. It's like removing all those barriers so that we can know our truest identity as the beloved sons and daughters of God and putting our faith in him. And it's a gift of grace, you know? So that's the heart of it, man. It's about amazing grace filling us and then spilling out of us into our families and our neighborhoods and our networks and our workplace.
Well, that's the whole idea, right? You don't want to have a glass half empty or a glass half full. You want to have a glass that's overflowing.
Yeah.
Something that I think longtime listeners of the show and you, because I've gone on these rants at your fire before, will know how I feel about the word empowerment. And I love how you talked about how Jesus empowers people, and you, as the Kansas City Underground, equip people.
That's it. I don't have to empower anybody. It's not my job.
And that is a message that a drum that I've been beating on this show for the longest time. And a lot of it's righteous indignation from my own history and my past. When you talked about how people will look to a priest or a pastor, and I'll just, fill in the blanks there for validation, for attaboy, for, approval, things like that. It's like, we are God's masterpiece. We come with power. You cannot empower who already has empowerment. And I said in one of my previous episodes, that, if you're having to empower people, it means that they've probably been disempowered. And if we're talking about in a company, they've probably felt disempowered by maybe previous leaders or because they got their hands slapped for doing something.
Yeah, it could be a structure issue. It could be a culture issue. But we're all born with this inherent, infinite value in the image of God stamped on our souls.
Right.
And when we begin to ask the questions like, how do we actually create a culture and create a structure that helps people be able to live into their maximum influence? And we're not trying to remove leadership.
Right.
Pastors play a very important role, and not everybody has the same level of influence, right?
Right.
I mean, some people have more influence than others, and that's not wrong. The question is, am I using that influence to elevate my platform, or am I using it to multiply the influence of as many people as I possibly can? And that's the heart of what we're doing with the Underground. How do we create? And we do it very imperfectly, man. we're figuring it out as we go along.
Yeah, I love that too. That's something that I have always gotten from you guys, even in my seasons of being too busy to get out to an equipping gathering or too busy or, you and I have had a lot of conversations, but I have always gotten the sense of how welcoming everybody in the Underground is. And just how gracious and graceful the network is. like if I want to learn more about something, there's something that somebody's doing that I can look with and partner up with. Shift KC is an example. I was laid off. It was like, while I'm applying for jobs, I might as well go into this entrepreneurial cohort that is starting with other people in my network. There's other sorts of ministries in it. It's totally, I don't know, there's just so much humanity in it. And when I look at, again, kind of transferring to The Starfish and the Spirit, your book that you co-authored with Lance Ford and Alan Hirsch, which I've got, already, I'm only halfway through, right? But I've got all these bookmarks here. For all of these, it's something that I think applies to the church, which I know this is written for, but it's also for churches and organizations. And I thought about that, and I started looking at some of these principles, and a lot of this, like with leadership, like helping people to know that they have a masterpiece mission, equipping them to be able to carry that out. And then if it's like a starfish, which I'll let you kind of explain the groundwork of that, it can grow from even the end of one of its legs, right?
Mm-hmm. That's the metaphor came from Ori Brofman and Rod Beckstrom. They wrote The Starfish and the Spider in 2006, I think it was. And at that point in time, I was actually leading global mission for a large church in Indiana and spending a lot of time in southern India. And there is what was a genuine movement that began there that ended up started with 7 indigenous leaders training ordinary people to make disciples and lead simple expressions of the church. And it ended up multiplying to being a movement of, more than 250,000 people whose lives have been changed radically by the grace of God, thousands of churches. I'm like 3 or 4 years into that journey and spending a couple months a year over there. And I read 2 books. One is called The Forgotten Ways. It's by Alan Hirsch, who's one of the co-authors. And that book is about like, hey, when the church goes kaboom, like movement kaboom, and becomes exponential, what's actually going on there? What elements are at play? And he defines 6 different elements that he calls MDNA or missional DNA or movement DNA. And then, so I'm on a plane ride to southern India, and I read that book because it takes about 26 hours to get to India. And I read The Spider and the Starfish on the same plane trip. Okay, so this one book is explaining church's movement, and it's helping me understand what's actually going on the ground in India. And then this other book is about a certain form of leadership, centralized leadership versus decentralized leadership. And the analogy they use is if you look at a spider and a starfish from the distance, they kind of look the same. They've got like these bodies in the center and these radial arms going out. But the way the power works is very different. So the locus of power for the spider is in the head. And if you crush the head of the spider, rip. It's dead. Rest in peace. If you cut off what looks like the head of the starfish, a lot of people don't know this. You actually will end up with 2 starfish. Like you can cut a starfish arm off and another starfish will grow from it. It operates like a neural network, and everything that's needed to reproduce the whole is in the smaller part of it. And so the idea is with the Jesus movement, like every single follower of Jesus has the potential of a movement inside of them. Just like inside of the seed is the potential for the entire forest. Inside of that spark is the potential for a forest fire. And the way the Bible describes it is simply this Christ in you, hope of glory. In other words, that when you look at what's able to happen in an ordinary person through the power of God in their life, the presence of God in their life, it's like a seed waiting for a forest to emerge. And we look at every single person. We try to look at every single person in the underground with that potential. Like sitting here with you, I'm like, I'm in the potential of greatness. Like I've seen the seed that you've planted and what's starting to come out of it. And there's a forest ahead. And we want to look at every single person. Like I don't see you as a volunteer.
Mm-hmm. Or a creator.
You're a creator, man. and you're a catalyst. You know, I don't want you to be a volunteer in my program. Like I want you to actualize your full calling, right? And so the starfish metaphor is the one that we want to live in. Like, how do we create a leadership culture where we're activating that kind of transformation and multiplication at every single level? Because you don't want to multiply unhealthy, sick stuff. So
right.
Like becoming more and more like Jesus, for us, he's the gold standard. You know,
I mean, and that's the thing. It's funny when you said decentralized network, I think about, Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, who wrote Extreme Ownership, Extreme Ownership and the dichotomy of leadership. And, I personally believe that all great forms of leadership come from God's example, God's ownership, Jesus's example, right? And the application. Like, there are CEOs of companies in this country and all over the world. If they would have heard what you just said, and hopefully they will because they listen to this show, if they were to hear what you said, that might change the entire 10-year outlook of their company. If they could say, you know what, everyone in this organization is here for a reason. They all have their gifts. They all have their strengths. They all have their talents. And we're going to equip people at every level to lead others and serve. And in a for-profit company, it's their customers, their shareholders, or whatever. But for me, it's universal application, and I'm not going to remove it from the kingdom, right? The kingdom of Jesus, right? I'm not going to remove it from that because that's what drives me. But even if do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
like,
I do, because
how it's expressed, even if not directly with credit to God, like it's going to come out. These ways are, they're the way to lead.
You could call them first principles, and they transcend cultures or contexts. And it's interesting, Ori Brofman, he's had contracts with lots of Fortune 500 companies. He's actually been hired with a long-term contract with the U.S. military because as they were beginning to interact with starfish organizations like terrorist organizations, where it's like there isn't really a head. This is about an ideology and cells that can infinitely reproduce. It's like, how do we train the U.S. military to know how to actually adapt for that kind of challenge?
They call them terror cells. Right?
Exactly. So these principles work, whether it's, unfortunately, an ideology of hate,
right,
or one that's going to propagate beauty, justice, and good news. And we live in an age where you look at any layer of culture, like think about just music and entertainment. Like when we were kids, it was Spider. It's like, well, there's 3 major networks. They control all the content. There's like 5 record labels.
Yep.
And like they all have their A&R people, and they are controlling and curating the music. And but now today, like since Napster and Spotify and Netflix, that's a starfish approach to media and music. And there's no way that's ever going back. Like that trend, the micro trend, is happening in every part of culture right now. There's a book called The End of Power that talks about these micro movements in every sphere of society and the radical change that it's bringing, and it's inevitable. Like the spider versus the starfish. Ultimately, think about mice reproducing in the field, right? Well, you may have a dinosaur trying to crush them all. The dinosaur's never going to be able to. They reproduce too quickly. You see what I'm saying? And they're able to pivot and scatter and regroup. So we live in the age of the starfish. Really, you can see it happening at every level of culture.
This podcast is a starfish movement. I didn't ask the permission of Geffen Records or
podcast is the starfish movement. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know it's like podcasters, we get a lot of crap because they say anybody can do it or whatever. But I think the stats are 90% of podcasts that are created don't make it past 21 episodes or something. So it's something we all have access to do, but to do it with longevity, it takes, you've got to want to do this when, you get 2 listens on an episode or you get adversity or whatever it is, and gosh, the principle. So let me ask you this. So the starfish and the spirit, where is that relationship, the spirit and the starfish? How'd you connect those two?
Well, what's really interesting is when we started writing this book, we actually started co-writing it with Ori Brofman, who wrote the spider and the starfish. And he got, we probably spent about 2 years working on the book with him. And at one point in time, we were going to call it The Starfish and the Church. And he said to us, if you think about it, this is about a move of God's Spirit. And it's not about a particular form of the church or the structure, which again, for someone kind of as an outsider of the church, for him to have that insight. And he said, I think it's going to... going with the starfish and the spirit will open up the conversation to include actually not just church leaders, but other organizations and other nonprofits.
Yeah.
And so we went with it. Eventually, it's amazing. This guy is, 100 times more brilliant than me or Lance, and that he was willing to look, and he was a professor at Berkeley. So it's kind of funny. It's like 2 pastors and a college professor from Berkeley
walk into a bar
and write a book. But he's also like an honest academic. So he looks at, okay, where did starfish decentralized leadership begin? What do you think the answer to that question is? Well, there is this Jewish rabbi named Jesus. And the church is really the first historical embodiment of a starfish movement. And a lot of people don't know this. The church was the first, it was the first like multi-ethnic community that was holding together all this diversity and not just ethnically, but socioeconomically, where the rich and poor in community and caring for one another. It was breaking all these sort of cultural rules. And then it was outside of the religious hierarchies that existed. And it's being led by like, this guy was a fisherman, right? Like, what? He's not qualified. He doesn't have, and they had a system of vetting that the leaders in the early church didn't tick the boxes on. You know what I mean? Inside of the religious structures, And so the church was a starfish movement. 300 years later, the Roman Empire and the church shook hands, and the church started to be remade in the image of the empire. And that was when the hierarchy became sort of a hard hierarchy, and we had church buildings for the first time. And there was a professionalization, like a clergy class began to exist. And God is so good and he's so gracious. There's still so many good things that have come through even the institutional church. So again, I'm not here to trash talk the institutional church.
That's right.
But we are trying to get back to that original starfish design. And it was fun. And having that kind of access to Ori. I'm like a nerd, so I was like, Ori Brofman's talking to me.
I would be too.
And he's written like 5 New York Times bestsellers. I mean, man, he's a remarkable guy.
I mean, you just, again, like there's been so many moments in my life too, where I'm like just this ragamuffin dude who's rough around the edges. And sometimes I'll, just speak, just unprofessionally and unpolished, and then I can like switch and all that. And I've gone through so many different identity crises in my life. When I started, in many ways, like even back when we lived in California 9 years ago, when I started to accept that, I had a set of skills. Like one of the first things was like, when the band blew up, it was like, oh my gosh, I should have gone to a college, I should have gotten a degree and all this stuff. And then when I got a degree and then I wanted to switch careers, it was like, oh my gosh,
I picked the wrong major.
I don't have the qualifications. And people so often, man, they focus on the qualifications. And, I've interviewed people on the show that, if you put them in front of a room of 1,000 people and gave them, 20 minutes to talk about what they're most passionate about, they're going to reach people. It's like they've been qualified through their experience and what they bring. And again, in the statement from KC Underground, like everybody is, God's masterpiece mission. We all hold this ability. It's funny, like I just learned too, I never thought of the church as the first starfish movement. And you've got me going back into all this stuff I've been looking into about archaeology and like, some of the Mesopotamian civilizations. And like I was telling you, I saw in this show or this podcast that the weathering on the Sphinx is like from water. And then the pyramid next to it, the Giza pyramid, shows weathering from wind. And like a lot of things that we're learning about are kind of getting blown up. We're finding that I'm kind of going off into a tangent there. But all that to say, like, yeah, I'm thinking of other major religious movements and Jesus being the first dude to say, like, yeah, I don't care if you're a fisherman. Come here. Let's hang out. I got some things I want to talk to you about. Things I'm going to show you. As you were talking about, just the mission in the context of the underground, being in a nonprofit space, I'm curious, what other nonprofits do you guys network with? Because that's been a topic on this show that we haven't really covered too much of. We've talked to another person who runs a nonprofit, but what's important for you as a nonprofit to understand as you're networking with people in the Kansas City region?
Yeah, as a nonprofit, the Kansas City Underground, we do network with other nonprofits. We believe if we're going to ask everyday people to network in terms of, okay, if you're, for example, Michelle and I, we felt this sense of calling to our neighborhood, that it would become a family and not just be strangers who live by each other. And that story's unfolded, and it's really changed our neighborhood. And it's not something we did by ourselves. It's something we did with first one family and then another family and another family. And suddenly there's 7 or 8 families that are truly doing life together in the way of Jesus. And it's changed the culture of our neighborhood. Like we've had neighbors move in, the last neighbors who moved in, they were there 2 weeks and they're like, we feel like we hit the jackpot. Like this neighborhood, everybody knows each other, loves each other, and there's parties and they're raising their kids together. Like what is
going on? You don't get to interview your neighbors when you go into a,
right.
You roll the dice when you move into a new neighborhood.
You do.
I mean, you really do, unless you already know people.
Right. And so we say to people like, wherever you're called and whatever you're called to, it's going to be a relational network. Right. So as an organization, we want to network as well. And so, for example, one of the organizations a nonprofit we network with is called Adopt a Village. And Adopt a Village is working in places where there are children who are being trafficked in unparalleled numbers, sex trafficking, children who are AIDS orphans. And they are starting churches that have a particular heart for the orphan. And they do an incredible job of like holistic child development so that these children don't get victimized. And they build capacity in these kids so that they can have a new legacy, like that they can find meaningful work. They can be educated. Their heart, mind, body, soul is flourishing, and they share the same DNA as us. They're trying to help all of God's people reach their maximum level of influence. And so for us, that as a nonprofit in Kansas City, to partner with a nonprofit that's working in some of the most marginalized communities in the world with the same heart, very same approach, DNA wise, strategy wise. We've even brought. It's interesting because some of the people that are leaders in the Kansas City Underground have done training with leaders in Adopt a Village, and then when we were starting the Kansas City Underground, some of the leaders from Adopt the Village from around the world actually came and did training here in the Kansas City Underground, like real partnerships.
Yep.
That are transformational. There's this kind of mutual benefit, even let me dare say the word submission, where it's like you have strengths where I'm weak, and I want to be humble enough to receive from you your strengths, and then vice versa. So in healthy transformational partnerships, like everybody leads and everybody follows, everybody gives, everybody receives, and so we have, for example, global partnerships like that. We also are a part of a larger network that's called the Underground Network. And the Underground Network are what we call sister movements of these decentralized networks of microchurches in multiple cities around America and around the world. And recently, in one area of our nonprofit, financial services, we really needed some significant input, coaching, insight. So we reached out to one of the sister movements, the one in Tampa, and it has been amazing because they're like 12 or 15 years older than us. So again, they've been down that road. So we're definitely trying to live into a networked identity at the local level, grassroots level in the city, but then even organizationally, we're trying to have a network of relationships with other nonprofits that allow us to share our strengths and let them buttress our weaknesses. So that's what it looks like for us.
And that's something
like too. Anyone who's just trying to exist in isolation as a nonprofit. You're going to end up way poorer and with a much smaller impact. And more, nonprofits shouldn't see each other as a threat or competition. It's like, how can we collaborate together? And I don't know how many nonprofits we've actually worked with the Kansas City Underground. If you were to type up the list, it'd be a long one. And we intend to keep that up.
That's something every guest on this show has said in one way or another, or in my conversations with them, that they do not take an approach of the other businesses in my space are competitors. And in your case, other nonprofits, it's like, find ways to connect. We know that there are things unique to nonprofits and struggles that people are going to go through, especially from my perspective. Now, I haven't run a nonprofit, but I know I know other folks from nonprofits that I've met or nonprofits I've supported. But when you're doing something out of your deepest conviction to where you say, I'm going to be a 501(c)(3), right? That's the designation for nonprofit. You are not in it for profit to, get your bank account full and all that stuff, which means you have to be more disciplined, more shrewd. Financial stewardship is that much more important. And you got to connect with other people that have figured out to maybe do what you're doing a better way, or you can adopt some operational principles from them. What are some of the challenges, I think, operationally about running the Kansas City Underground that you guys have had to learn? Because I know up to before launching Kansas City Underground, you had worked for larger church organizations, right?
Yeah.
So now you're out there, you're a leader in this, you're not alone, but what are some things that you guys have learned, to keep yourself financially whole too, so that, you're able to have people on the team that can devote their lives to it, and also support the causes that are bringing, the justice and the good news to the Kansas City region?
Yeah, we've tried to, as a nonprofit that really is here to help forward these simple expressions of church and ordinary people, helping other people discover the love of God in Christ. We've tried to, for example, minimize infrastructure costs to make it as lean and mean as possible so that more of the charitable giving that comes in can actually go to the direct work of the ministry, like in the streets, back in the blood and the mud, like actually out the door into impact. And so we were inspired. One of the reasons we became the Kansas City Underground is because we watched this underground network that had emerged starting with Tampa, and it spread, I think, to 5 or 6 other cities at the time. And one of the things that we did early on was, again, this is not an attack.
Yep.
But with the kind of traditional model of church, typically there is pretty high infrastructure costs. There's buildings that are being owned and operated. Typically, there's higher staffing costs. So we pivoted to think of ourselves more like a mission agency than a organizational church. And when you take on the mindset of a mission agency, like when we started, the original staff team of the Underground, like we made a commitment. We're going to go raise support. And for like Michelle and I, we were like, we're going to raise our support from outside of Kansas City. And then we'll have other jobs. So I've typically had 1 to 2 other jobs so that the burden of my salary won't be on the Kansas City Underground, And so we've tried to create a very lean and mean infrastructure in terms of staff costs and then the hard costs of like owning buildings. Like for example, the Western Edge Hub, we lease a space that's in kind of a little strip mall, but then we also sublease it so that people that are having like business owners that want to do an offsite day of strategy, like they love our space. There's been a ton of like baby showers and wedding showers. And so again, it's helping us become lean and mean so that more of the mission more of the money can actually hit the mission. I don't know if that's what you're asking though. Are you just asking about money or what else are you asking about?
That is like, you could not have given me a better answer to dive into that, the operational stuff. Like, how do you do this? Like,
and that's what's interesting. Like these are what people would call our leadership teams. We call our hub teams. Mm-hmm. They're the ones that are really giving their time and energy to equip people to live into their masterpiece mission, to lead these simple expressions of their church, to keep them healthy. There's oversight, there's coaching, there's training. Pretty much all of those hub leaders are bivocational. They have 1 or 2 or 3 jobs. And a number of them, for example, there's a new hub team that's in Raytown, and they've been going for, I think, about a year and a half. And they have a building that's on the main street in Raytown, stone's throw from Hart Barbecue, Crane Brewing. And what they're doing with their hub space is they're going to start with 3 or 4 businesses. So they're going to have a coffee shop, they're going to have an event space, industrial kitchen, and like a 3-chair beauty shop. And all the people that are leading these businesses are going to be using them as training platforms. So the beauty shop is actually going to be training beauticians. The coffee shop is going to be training baristas. The event space and the little music studio, they're envisioning doing like a school of rock. They're about half a mile from the local high school, like using this so that students can become musicians and make music. And then there's an event space to do shows. And then the industrial kitchen is there to help people that are, let's say, doing food trucks. So the whole thing is built with multiplication in mind. It's built with this entrepreneurial spirit in mind. And then the dollars that are being given, let's say to Raytown, now are going to get multiplied through these businesses. It's not just constantly dependent on charitable giving. It's becoming a platform to actually lift Raytown. because that Main Street, I don't know if you've been there, there's a lot of empty buildings, man. You know, and there is some renewal happening, right? Like I just mentioned 2 landmark businesses, you know, that a lot of people would know of. Well, the hub team in Raytown wants to be a part of that story, man. They want to see that area of Raytown revitalized, and they want to see, their vision is to see every home fully alive in Raytown. Isn't that cool?
I love that, man.
Yeah. So when you start building in this mindset of like starfish, multiplication, you start asking that at every level. Like, how can we, if we're going to do this training, how can it be simple and reproducible enough that it can multiply across the network?
Right.
If we're going to have a hub space, how do we put multiplication into this space so that it eventually can be self-sustaining and then maybe multiply,
right,
you know, more nonprofits or more businesses?
You know, there's been this tension in my mind ever since I started my journey as a, you know, business growth coach and with the podcast and stuff. And I've had people correct me in conversations. They go, well, you know, it's a nonprofit. That's not entrepreneurial at all. Right. And I feel like a resistance in my gut to that statement because of what you just said, you know, talking about, you know, just the example of like the Shawnee Hub, you know, allowing, you know, business owners to come in and do an offsite meeting there, you know, do weddings and birthday parties and baby showers and things like that. And I go, that's very entrepreneurial. Like, it's like, I have this space. It can be a place where people come to gather to talk about Jesus and what we're doing in Kansas City Underground, or it can be where, you know, Maria comes and has her baby shower. You know, we live in a time where there's so many different ways to bring income in and leverage like digital media platforms and social media. And it, like you said, I mean, I love how you said it doesn't have to be all charitable giving, you know. What are some things that you would say to people who are, maybe they're working in ministry for another nonprofit or a church and they're wanting to maybe launch something on their own? You know, what are some things that you would ask them, you know, sitting down with them, like, you know, to make sure they're ready to go do this or live in their calling? You know, I ask people all the time, like, you know, marketing folks who have started their own marketing firm. I go, you know, what do you have to say to people who are maybe working for a marketing company right now and they want to go out and they want to do it differently? You know, what you've learned, I mean, as a teaching pastor as well, you know, going out and starting this movement. I mean, what's important for people to know about that journey?
Yeah, I think first of all, you do have to have clarity of mission and vision. Like, can you articulate the why for me? And then what is unique about that? Like, is that already being done? And it's fine if it is, but what's the unique thing that sets what you want to start apart? Because this is going to be very, very, very hard. And if you don't have a big enough why and that kind of clarity about your mission, your vision, and the unique part of it that has kind of that thumbprint that's unlike anything else. And then the second thing I always encourage people is only build as enough trellis, like the minimal trellis. Like, you can plant tomatoes and they grow, and then you don't try to build like 50 feet of trellis before the tomatoes grow. Like, you give them what they need as they grow. So you ask yourself, like, what's the minimal sort of trellis that you need? And then be willing to constantly have this culture of humility, curiosity, iteration. Like, you have to think about these as experiments, and you're constantly evolving and adapting and learning and changing. And the second that stops is you've begun to die. Like, you will never have arrived. And it's this constant journey of discovery and humility to be willing to say, hey, in this season, this was really helpful. But now this is actually the thing. Sometimes the things that were your strength can literally become the things that are the barrier to the next chapter. So for example, just a story from when we began, there was 72 committed kind of missional leaders. We had 3 of these microchurches. And for us, a microchurch it's an extended spiritual family. It's led by ordinary people. They're owning the mission of Jesus in a very particular network of relationships. And they begin to do life together around what we call worship, community, and mission. So worship is we want to move from unbelief to belief in Jesus in every area of life. He's the master at the art of living. We want to learn how to follow him in every area of life. Community is the Bible has what is called the one another commands. And there's dozens of them. And there's these simple commands are usually like 3 or 4 words long, like love one another.
Yeah.
Bear one another's burdens, forgive one another, instruct one another, encourage one another. It's just all, and like, how do we activate all those one another's as a family in the everyday stuff of life? So church isn't an event. It isn't an event or a meeting. It's actually a family that's following Jesus, living into these one another commands. And then mission is, hey, we want to make God's kingdom tangible. We want to bring up there, down here. And we want to help other people discover Jesus and begin to follow him, or what he called disciples. So that's what a microchurch is, right?
Right.
So we start with 3 microchurches, 72 missional leaders, and then 1 hub team. Well, now it's multiplied to like 110 microchurches and 380 missional leaders and 110 of these microchurches around the city. And it started down here at the western edge, and now we're literally kind of scattered around the city. There's people in Casey Mo, there's people in Independence, there's people in Raytown, there's people in Gardner, there's people in Prairie Village, there's people in Overland Park. You get the idea. Well, that original hub team, we were the ones that trained all these other hub teams, right? And that makes perfect sense. Like we actually have what we call a hub launch cohort. And it's like once you begin to see 3 or 4 or 5 microchurches begin to emerge, like you're going to see a leadership team in there that's beginning to emerge, like people that want to own equipping and training. Right. And they're kind of like spiritual mothers and fathers, big brothers, big sisters. We train them like, okay, what do we need to be a starfish kind of multiplying team? So 11 of those teams. What happened sort of incidentally is that first hub team also became like an operations team for the whole Kansas City Underground.
That makes sense.
Right?
Yeah.
And that made perfect sense until there's 11 hub teams and the ops team now is just the OGs. That doesn't actually help the network. It misrepresents the network.
It sounds very spider almost.
It was unintentional.
Sure.
And it actually was a part of our progressive journey of like, hey, we're multiplying hub teams. But now we're actually going through a year-long process to basically redesign our leadership structure. So how can we build a new table that becomes the operations team that's actually representative of the whole network?
Right.
And we begin to look and say, what seats do we need at that table now? And the original team, it's in some ways, it's been like a death for us. Because that original ops team, we've had a blast. And we've seen some pretty amazing things happen. And it's like this team isn't going to exist anymore. And if we hang on to this, it could kill the underground. And so we have to let go of that and say, okay, I might not be on this new ops team. I may just be at the Western Edge Hub team. Because we want to go through a collaborative process where it's like, just because I'm an OG doesn't mean I'm guaranteed a seat at this new table. Because we've actually brought in 2 outside organizations to help us. Again, networking. One of them is called Arabond, which works on helping organizations create a higher capacity for diversity and to be able to hold that with a spirit of reconciliation and joy and wholeness, because we've become a more diverse network and we need to up our cultural capacity. And then there's another organization called the Movement Leaders Collective, which works on organizational design. Because actually bringing them in is like to lead these sort of like town hall kind of conversations. It's better for them in some ways to do that than it would be for me. Because if I'm leading it, there's still that imbalance of power. You know what I'm saying?
I love how, I think really too, this is a great note to sort of give ourselves a conclusion here, but that is gosh, man, hearing you say, I might not be the guy to be at the new operations table, and being able to say that as a leader. I had somebody tell me back in December that they started a nonprofit or a movement, and they said, I realized that I could die before this is actualized, or this could have been my idea, but somebody else's to carry. And I know you're not talking about like handing it off. I mean, you're going to be in the underground. You're going to have 100%. A leadership role, but realizing that your strengths and your gifts are, might not be a match for a component of a new thing that needs to happen. Mm-hmm. That just takes such maturity as a leader.
Well, I think
to do that, right?
I think in most, whether it's the church or it's the business world, it's usually, I think, emotional immaturity that ends up being the real block. It's when people are insecure in their identity, where they begin to equate their value and their worth with a particular job title, a particular role, that creates that scarcity mindset. And a lot of times it's not that people don't have the intellectual savvy. It's more like, okay, let's just be honest. Right now, I'm acting like a 13-year-old emotionally because I feel threatened by this change, because I think my identity, my value is my job title or my job performance. And if this feels like a demotion, then it feels like my worth as a human being is being threatened. And that's why, again, you're talking about counsel for people. It's like you have to do the work inside of the work. Like if you're not working on yourself in terms of your relational, spiritual, intellectual, emotional health and flourishing, your organization is going to be sick, because it comes out of the overflow, I think, of personal wholeness, especially when you're a culture creator.
Man, we will be posting notes or the ways to interact with the underground and NewThing. What's the next best step for anybody that's interested in what they heard you talk about today?
Yeah, if you're interested in connecting with the underground, we have something called Get to Know the Kansas City Underground. It happens once a month. It's in real life meeting where you can circle up in one of our hub spaces and meet some of the hub leaders. And we walk through kind of who we are, how we can serve you, help you tap into your masterpiece mission. That would be a great way to do it. We have a podcast. People are interested. Right. You can listen to the Kansas City Underground podcast. That's available wherever podcasts can be found. And then, of course, kcunderground.org is a great place to get to know us better as well.
Awesome. Rob, I so appreciate you coming on the show, man. So many nuggets. We're going to have to do like a part 2 or something later on this year. Thank you all for listening to Kansas City Business Cast. Really appreciate your support. Remember, we will gladly accept any ratings, subscriptions, reviews, and we've got the option for those who are able to support us on a financial basis, on a monthly basis. Thank you so much, guys.